This is the Siege of Malta lecture series, episode 3. This episode is called Valette's Flawless Defense, part 1 of many. So this is episode 3 of the series, and I'll be talking about La Valette. That is Grand Master Jean de la Valette. This particular subject is going to have multiple episodes, and they aren't going to all come in a row. For today's episode, I'm going to focus on his initial preparations for the siege, beginning before 1565, and then his initial responses to the Turks' invasion, beginning on May the 18th, 1565. Here's a little bit of context for you. So the knights took up a residence in Malta in 1530, after being forcibly removed from their island home of Rhodes in 1522 by an enormous Ottoman army headed by Suleiman himself. By the time 1565 comes around, the island had 4 main fortresses: St. Angelo, St. Michael, St. Elmo, and the ancient capital of Medina. It would be Valette's strategy to hold out in these fortresses for as long as possible and wait for a relief force to be sent by one of the Christian princes, namely Don Garcia de Toledo, the then Viceroy of Sicily. The Turks were of the impression that a conquest of Malta was possible now, but if left any longer in the knights' hands, then they would fortify it further and the island would become impregnable and impossible to take. This is in fact what happened, as Malta was in the knights' possession from 1530 to 1798, when eventually Napoleon Bonaparte took it from them. La Valette had spies in Constantinople, and he received word in the year 1564 that the Turks were assembling a huge armada. Balbi has it that a Greek knight who was a knight of the order was living in Constantinople and was undercover in the chambers of the principal pashas themselves, acting as a spy. It was strongly suspected by the Grand Master that this armada was coming his way and that the Turks' plan was to besiege and capture Malta. Throughout the siege, the knights were primarily garrisoned in the following 4 fortresses: St. Angelo and the surrounding town called Birgu, St. Angelo being the headquarters. Directly next door to St. Angelo was St. Michael on the Senglia Peninsula. Across the Grand Harbour was St. Elmo, which commanded the entrance to the Grand Harbour and the Marsa Macheto. And finally we have Medina, the ancient capital located in the centre of the island upon rising ground. I will give greater details on all of these fortresses in future episodes. However, the main focus of this episode is the strategy of the Grand Master. I'm going to expound to you a list now of what Valette was up against. This is from Balbi's first-hand account, and bear in mind he had contact with high-ranking Turkish deserters. The list is as follows. I'll begin with the fleet. So the following ships sailed from Constantinople for Malta: 130 royal galleys, 30 galleots, 9 barges, 10 large merchantmen, and about 200 smaller transports. Aboard those ships, we have 6,000 Spahis, all archers, commanded by a Sanjik Bey and 2 lieutenants, 500 Spahis under a Sanjik Bey from Karamania, 400 adventurers under a Sanjik Bey from Mytilene, 6,000 Janissaries of the Sultan's bodyguard, the cream of the Turkish army, all musketeers, 2,500 Spahis from Romania, 3,500 adventurers under the command of a Sanjik Bey and an Ali Bey, 4,000 adventurers, all of them religious fanatics, and 6,000 corsairs, all sailors. Lastly, Balbi records that there were many Jewish merchants who joined the expedition with a lavish supply of goods and money so as to be able to purchase Christian slaves. That's God's chosen people out to purchase Christian slaves. How wonderful is that? The total number of fighting men who sailed from the Levant to attack Malta was 28,000. A reliable estimate of the men who took part in the actual attack in Malta is 48,000 men. This includes the corsairs from the Levant, the followers of Dragut, king of Tripoli, and the force led by Hassan, ruler of Algiers. In charge of the artillery, there was a Turkish general, and there were also 5 trained engineers: 1 Greek, 1 Slav, a Venetian, an Italian renegade, and a Turk. So if that was what Valette was up against, I'm going to give you the list of what he had. He reviewed his forces before the arrival of the Turkish Armada. The following are their numbers. So firstly, most importantly, 500 knights of all the longs, 400 Spaniards under the command of Miranda and Juan de la Cerda, 200 Italians under the command of Hasdrubal de Medici, 400 Italians under Colonel Mass, 200 Italians under Della Motte, 100 soldiers of the garrison of St. Elmo, 500 soldiers of the galleys, 100 servants of the Grand Master and of the Knights, 200 Greek and Sicilian residents in Malta, 500 galley slaves and mercenary oarsmen, and 3,000 Maltese out of the island. The men, women and children of the island were available for labour together with 1,000 slaves of the order and a great many beasts of burden. Of course, Valette didn't want anyone there who was unable to help. He didn't want people to be a drain on the resources that were already scant. So anyone that was unable to aid in the defence of Malta was sent to Sicily. Don Garcia de Toledo made it clear to the Sicilians that they were to treat the Maltese refugees like good neighbours. By early 1565, it was expected that Malta was going to have to withstand a siege from the Ottomans, and so Valette appealed to the Pope and the kings of Europe for assistance. In February that year, on the orders of Philip II of Spain, Don Garcia de Toledo travelled to Italy and held a conference with the Duke of Savoy, the Council of the Republic of Genoa, the Duke of Florence, the Pope, and the Viceroy of Naples. He then sailed for Malta and Gozo with 3,000 Spanish troops and 30 galleys. The Viceroy stayed for a day and a half in Malta, where he conferred with the Grand Master about the expected Ottoman attack. Don Garcia offered to leave his contingent of troops behind for the defence of the island, but Valette declined this offer until the intentions of the enemy were better known. Valette did, however, accept the offer of a relief force should it be required. Don Garcia then left the Maltese archipelago and returned to Sicily after deploying some troops on Gozo, which he deemed sufficient for its defence. Now it was clear that the Turks were to attack Malta. The Grand Master looked to the island's defence. This is where his brilliance as a military man begins to shine through. Everything he did pertaining to the defence of Malta is nigh on perfect. From the fortifications he chose to expand, and in what manner to the way he deployed his men, he operated flawlessly. He made the following improvements to the fortifications. He strengthened the Ravelin and the Cavalier of Fort St. Michael. He then reinforced St. Elmo with an outer parapet of gabions and earth. Many of the houses of the district outside Birgu were demolished near the posts of Aragon and St. Michael. This was done primarily to stop the Turks from taking cover in these buildings, and also the building materials could be recycled and used in reinforcing the fortresses. On May the 7th, the Grand Master ordered Don Francisco de Sanaguera to take his galley, St. Gabriel, and lay a chain across the mouth of the harbour. Apparently this was done on the side of the Marsa Macheto. This task was completed by the next day. On May the 8th, one of Valette's Moorish spies returned from the North African coast with information about Turkish preparations for the siege, and the news that the Turkish fleet was at Modon was confirmed when Don Juan de la Cerda arrived. He brought with him the troops of Captain Andres de Miranda, which were commanded in his captain's absence by his lieutenant Medrano. Later on, de la Cerda brought from Palermo 6 companies of Spanish infantry, and before leaving Malta, he sailed around the island and made a complete survey. Galleys of the order continued to bring in soldiers from Sicily, mostly Italians and Spaniards, and they were then deployed by Valette. Valette knew that his hope of a relief force came from Messina in Sicily, so he put the man Signorino Gattinara, the prior of Messina, in charge there, giving him full command of the relief force that was being assembled and authority to deal with the order's affairs and borrow whatever money was needed for the defence of the island. At this time, the order's galleys went back and forth from Sicily, bringing soldiers and offloading civilians who could not participate in the fighting. Any ships carrying food or wine they came across in the channel were redirected to Malta, where they were paid well for their cargoes. The Grand Master then ordered the knights Luigi Balbiano and Adrian Maimon to get all the Maltese inhabitants to harvest their crops and come within the fortifications, bringing their cattle, something they failed to do. Later on in the siege, we see that the Maltese oxen that weren't brought inside, dragging the Turkish artillery, which must have been very annoying to the Grand Master. The French knight Pierre de Joux encountered a ship at Reggio laden with wheat, whose Genoese captain, Geronimo Villavecchia, willingly sailed to Malta. He and his crew served valiantly throughout the siege on the side of the knights. Valette assigned every man to his post and gave everyone their duties during this time. I shan't list every major detail as I plan to record in full a reading of Balbi's account, chapter by chapter. The Grand Master suspended all civil and criminal actions throughout the siege and freed all prisoners so that they were able to take part in the defence. At this point, all the preparations that could have been made had been made, and the defenders waited in a state of readiness for the Turks. The Grand Master had taken all the necessary steps to make as sufficient a defence as possible, but was still uneasy about the danger that awaited them. Balbi writes, "We who were to endure the siege under his command felt much the same as our noble commander." The Turkish fleet arrived at Malta on Friday the 18th of May, 1565. They were spotted by the watchmen on St. Angelo and St. Elmo, the fleet being fanned out in a crescent. A signal was given and 2 guns were fired to warn Gozo and Medina. Upon hearing the signal, the islanders rushed into Birgu, although some of them were redirected to St. Michael to prevent overcrowding. It appeared as if the fleet was approaching the island and heading for Marsa-Shlock. Upon seeing this, the Grand Master dispatched the marshal from Birgu to oppose the landing with over 100 knights, alongside Captain Medrano's company and that of Colonel Mass, as well as some of La Motte's men. They were accompanied by the cavalry under Captain Juan de Guaras, a total of 1,000 fighting men. When the Turks saw that they couldn't land unopposed, they took a southerly course along the island. The defenders followed them on foot and on horseback until nightfall. Part of the fleet was anchored off Majar, and once it was dark, sentries were posted at strategic points, and the rest of the force marched inland to Medina. On May the 19th, we have the whole incident when the knight La Riviere is captured by the Turks, which I won't repeat. If you'd like to hear that story, it's on episode 2 of the Siege of Malta lecture series. It was on this day that Valette gave the fortuitous order that the cavalry should retreat to Medina, as he believed they would be able to hit the enemy in the rear from that position as the siege progressed, an assumption that proved to be completely accurate and in no uncertain way saved the defenders further on down the line during the assault on St. Michael, which will be discussed in a future episode. By the 21st of May, the Turks had landed the bulk of their army and artillery and took to the village of St. John, with their main camp being set up in the Marsa. On the same day, the Turks made a demonstration to the defenders and displayed their power. They played their instruments loudly and showed their numbers to intimidate the knights. 40,000 plus men, Balbi reports in his diary. This may have also served as a reconnaissance mission as well to some extent. Valette responded by having all the defenders' flags unfurled and the drums beaten. He then initiated an engagement with the Turks with 700 arquebusiers under the Marshal, Captain Medrano, Colonel Mass, Lamora, Pierre de Joux, Romgar, and many other knights. The cavalry charged as well at this time under Captain Guaras, and a fierce engagement took place. The far superior numbers of the Turks was mitigated by the faster rate of fire of the defenders' arquebuses. The arquebuses of the Janissaries were about 9 palms long, and certainly not less than 7. The result was that they were not easy to aim and took a long time to reload. Valette held a force in reserve of over 1,000 men, but had to physically hold the gate with a lance on his hand to prevent them from attacking the Turks. Such was their eagerness to shed blood. This engagement lasted for 5 hours and resulted in the deaths of over 1,000 Turks, including a Sanjak Bey and other officers. Valette had lost about 10 men, including 2 knights, but part of this can be attributed to a gunpowder accident in which a barrel exploded, killing a number of soldiers. On this day as well, that's the 21st of May, there's actually another deserter that I missed in the last episode. So this guy is a Greek deserter, Greek so-called. They give him the name Baptist, not a very appropriate name in this case. Baptist escaped the enemy during the 5 hours of the initial engagement. So he says that he was one that had been captured on the Turkish merchantman. So he's not been in Malta that long. The Turkish merchantman, the merchant ship, is what I presume Romgar captured in 1564. Now that will be discussed on another episode, but I think that is the ship that they are talking about here. So that being the case, he's not been there very long at all. My only question about this is the fact that Balbi says that this guy Baptist has a wife and children, but if he came from the merchantman that was captured by Romgar in 1564, there's not much time there for that to happen. So there's a footnote in Balbi's book from Ernley Bradford that says that it was this merchantman. It's the ship belonging to Aga, and that puts the capture of that ship in 1564. And this guy Baptist he's already got a wife and children in Malta. So I'm not quite sure what's going on there. He may have had a wife and a child, but I don't think he had time to reproduce multiple times. Even so, this guy is a Muslim, circumcised. This says, Balbi makes a note of that. But he also says that he was a first-class caulker, which is someone who puts like a kind of sealant on boats. And he also says that he was an excellent underwater swimmer. The Grand Master actually gave him his freedom to do his job, but when the fighting starts, he's tempted to go back over to the Turks, apparently. And as I just mentioned, he had a wife and children, but that wasn't really a problem for him. He didn't really care. Abandons those first chance he gets. Like, the Neapolitan knight deserted on the 19th, so that's the world record for desertions. One day, this guy's, quite quick, behind him, 3 days. When this guy goes back to the Turks, Valette himself is actually very distressed because he understands that this guy's a very good underwater swimmer, and there's the fear that he might sabotage the chain that is blocking off the mouth of the harbour. And he thinks that he might be able to do this by swimming underwater and drilling holes in the buoys which support the chain. So in order to counteract this, Valette gives orders that 4 small boats should keep continual watch on the chain, and that was sufficient. That did the trick because the chain wasn't interfered with. So at this point, the Grand Master sent dispatches in the galley Santiago to go to Sicily under the command of his nephew, Commander Cornejon. This galley was chosen because it was quick, and it basically had to get through the blockade. So now they're blockaded in Malta, and getting in and out of the island by sea is going to be really hard. I say by sea, that's the only way they could get in and out, but it's going to be very difficult now because they are in fact blockaded. A few days before the Turks' arrival, Valette has sent his own galley out to the Barbary coast to basically get information about the enemy's intentions, but when the galley returned, it was unable to run the blockade, so that the galley that Valette sent and the Santiago, when it returned, were forced to stay outside during the whole siege. And of course, this was a great shame because those boats were actually carrying 600 men who could have been used for the defence of the island, but they were forced not to participate because of the blockade. Now, the blockade wasn't always successful. Valette did manage to get a lot of dispatches out to Sicily, and realistically he shouldn't have been able to do that, but the blockade was successful in the fact that these 2 boats couldn't get back in. This is what I would describe as the end of the initial part of the invasion. They've had this initial clash, and then things sort of settle down. The Turks then have this big council when they decide where they're going to attack. Of course, as we know from lecture number 1, they decide to attack St. Elmo, which works out really well for the knights, and it's really a stroke of luck for them. But at this point, the initial phase is over. And from here on, we begin to see the Turks preparing to assault St. Elmo, to invest it, and the next part of the siege for the knights is the defence and reinforcing of St. Elmo, whilst they strengthen the fortifications at Birgu and St. Michael. So as we can see during this initial encounter, Valette is fairly conservative. He doesn't opt for some huge pitched battle because he's so outnumbered. He allows this sort of skirmish to take place where they do come out on top, the knights. They get some nice kills on the Turks, some officers and the Sanjik Bey, whilst taking minimal casualties of their own. He's got his cavalry in the right place in Medina, which can hit the enemy in the rear, and now Valette is preparing for the defence of St. Elmo, because what he wants at this point is just to buy time, because now he wants the relief force to come, and that's what he's doing right now. He's playing for time, so I'm going to leave it there for now. There will be further episodes because I want to go through Valette's strategy throughout the siege. So this is the first installment of that, and then we can have more of this as the siege progresses. The end. If you enjoyed, like and subscribe. More's coming.